The house felt like an echo of what it used to be. Every corner whispered memories she tried to forget, laughter in the kitchen, warm touches in the hallway, arguments that ended in tears behind closed doors. Now all that remained was silence. Boxes lined the hallway, filled with remnants of a man who no longer loved her. Clothes that no longer carried his scent. Books he never finished reading. Ties he never wore. She had packed them methodically at first, thinking that action would dull the pain, but with each item she folded away, the weight on her chest grew heavier. She moved slowly around the living room, dragging her fingers across the mantel where their anniversary photo used to sit. Dust had begun to settle where the frame once was. Her feet ached, but she didn't care. She hadn't eaten since the night before. Hunger meant little now. There was nothing to look forward to, no one to make dinner for. Her eyes were red from crying, but the tears still came, as if her body refused to acknowledge that there should be an end to grief. She dropped onto the couch and pressed her palms into her face. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical, rooted in her bones, gnawing at her like something alive. Upstairs, the bathroom door creaked open, but she paid no attention. She had forgotten he was even there. Her stepson had come by earlier that day, offering to help carry some boxes or fix the broken window in the guest room. He had always been polite, respectful, a bit distant since she married his father, but nothing more. She didn't expect him to stay, let alone notice the way she was unraveling. At first, she told him he didn't need to stay, but he insisted, said she shouldn't be alone. She appreciated the gesture, even though she felt embarrassed by her condition. Hair unwashed, makeup smudged, clothes wrinkled and clinging to her skin like she had slept in them, which she had. The air in the house was heavy, despite the open windows. Summer had pressed itself into the walls, and even the evening brought little relief. She fumbled with the remote, trying to distract herself with television, but every show reminded her of what she no longer had. Couples holding hands. Parents laughing with their children. Dinner tables lit by candlelight and warmth. Her hand trembled, and the remote slipped to the floor with a dull clatter. That was when the tears came back. Not quiet sobs, but deep, guttural cries that shook her shoulders and made it hard to breathe. She curled into herself, her body shrinking against the cushions as if she could disappear. She hated how weak she felt. Hated that she didn't scream at him when he left. Hated that she still loved him, even after everything. She wiped her nose on the sleeve of her sweater, then curled her knees to her chest. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she felt like she might throw up. The door creaked behind her, but she didn't turn around. She didn't want to be seen like this, broken, humiliated, abandoned. She didn't want anyone to witness her crumbling. She had spent years holding things together. Pretending to be the understanding wife, the supportive stepmother, the one who smoothed the tension between her husband and his son. And now what was left? Just a shell of the woman she used to be. The footsteps approached slowly. She heard the floorboard sigh under his weight. He didn't speak. The silence was somehow worse than words. Then a pause. She sensed his presence behind the couch, the stillness of someone who didn't know what to do but didn't want to leave. She tried to pull herself together, to wipe her face, to sit up straighter, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if her grief had paralyzed her. She felt exposed, raw, and deeply ashamed. And yet, she didn't ask him to go. Something shifted in the air between them, something subtle but undeniable. He wasn't just a visitor offering help anymore. He wasn't a stranger, but he wasn't family either. Not really. Not now. Not after his father's betrayal and the divorce that shattered every assumed boundary. What were they to each other now when the thread that tied them together had been cut? He moved closer. She felt the warmth of his presence behind her. Still, he said nothing. She expected pity, but what she felt instead was curiosity. Attention. Noticing. He didn't look away. He didn't judge. And maybe that more than anything was why she didn't resist it. The desire to not feel invisible, even if just for a moment, even from someone she never imagined could offer comfort. Her head dropped back against the couch, and her eyes closed. The crying had stopped, but her chest still ached. She heard him lower himself beside her, felt the cushion shift beneath their combined weight. Her heart thudded once, heavily, and then again. She didn't know why, but her pulse had changed. The room was still. The air was thick. And for the first time in days, she felt the warmth of another body beside her. Not out of obligation. Not out of pity. But something different. Something she wasn't ready to name. The next morning brought with it a pale, diffused light that crept through the sheer curtains of the living room, casting a dull glow over the cluttered coffee table and half-packed boxes. The woman stirred slowly on the couch, her limbs heavy and aching from the awkward position she had fallen asleep in. Her sweater was twisted, clinging uncomfortably to her back, and a faint chill lingered in the air. She blinked against the brightness, her memory foggy but slowly piecing itself together. Her gaze shifted toward the opposite end of the couch, where the throw blanket had been tucked neatly over her legs. She hadn't done that herself. The realization crept in gradually. He had stayed, and at some point during the night he had covered her. Her heart gave a slow, uncertain thud. The house was unusually quiet for that hour. She pushed herself upright, her joints protesting, and tried to listen for any movement upstairs. Nothing. Maybe he had left already. Maybe he had realized staying too long was a mistake. But as she stood and walked toward the kitchen, she heard faint sounds, drawers opening, the soft clinking of silverware. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting against the frame. There he was, standing at the stove, shirtless, his back to her as he stirred something in a small saucepan. Her breath caught for a second, not just from the surprise of seeing him still there, but from the striking presence he had in that moment. Comfortable, assured, unbothered by the strangeness of the situation. She should have said something, should have made a sound, but she remained silent, watching him move with casual ease. It felt intimate in a way that unsettled her, as if she were observing something she wasn't meant to see. And yet she didn't look away. Her eyes traced the curve of his shoulder blades, the way his muscles moved with each slight motion. She told herself it was only because she was caught off guard, that she was just still emotionally raw from the night before. But deep down she knew that wasn't the whole truth. Eventually he turned around and saw her standing there. She managed a faint nod, unsure of how else to acknowledge him. He didn't seem surprised to see her awake, nor did he make a big deal of the fact that he was still there. He offered her something warm to eat, placing a plate on the counter, and gestured toward the coffee maker. She moved slowly, unsure if she should accept his unspoken invitation to sit, but her body led her before her thoughts could catch up. The smell of the food filled the kitchen, grounding her in a reality she had forgotten could still exist, simple, quiet comfort. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds were the soft scraping of forks against plates and the distant hum of a car passing by outside. But beneath the quietness, something had shifted. The air between them was no longer filled with awkwardness or familial distance. There was something else taking shape, something undefined but undeniable. She could feel his eyes on her occasionally, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her aware. Aware of her own presence, her own body, her own vulnerability. She glanced at him across the table, wondering if he was thinking about the night before. Wondering if he had noticed how long she had cried, how close they had been sitting when she finally fell asleep. She wondered if he had felt the same strange tension that had wrapped around her like a second skin. She didn't dare ask. There was no language for what was beginning to form between them, no script for this kind of proximity. He was her former stepson. She was his father's ex-wife. And yet, that bond had fractured the moment the man who tied them together walked out of their lives. As the day wore on, he stayed. He helped with the remaining boxes, lifting them carefully into the garage, organizing things she had ignored for weeks. He didn't speak much, but his presence was constant, steady in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She watched him move around the house, noticing the quiet confidence in his posture, the way he seemed unbothered by the emotional mess she still carried. He wasn't afraid of her sadness, and that alone made her want to let him stay. At one point, she sat on the back porch, sipping lukewarm tea, trying to let her thoughts settle. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows on the grass, and the hum of summer insects filled the silence. He joined her without a word, sitting just close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither of them spoke, and yet, everything that needed to be said seemed to exist in the silence between them. Later that evening, after he had helped her carry the last box up to the attic, he paused at the top of the stairs. She stood just behind him, breathing a little harder than usual, the dust and heat from the attic making her chest feel tight. He looked back at her, his eyes lingering a little longer than necessary. She held his gaze for a moment, too long, and then looked away. When they returned downstairs, she offered him a drink, not because she was being polite, but because she didn't want him to leave just yet. He accepted, and they sat on the living room floor, leaning against the couch. The lights were dim. A soft breeze drifted in through the open window. And again, that strange electricity returned. The closeness, the quiet, the weight of their shared solitude. She didn't know what any of it meant, or where it was going. She only knew that when he finally stood to leave, the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. And when the door closed behind him, her chest tightened with something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to longing. The following days unfolded with a strange rhythm, one that the woman found both unsettling and comforting. Each morning she woke earlier than usual, her senses sharpened in quiet anticipation, even if she refused to admit what exactly she was waiting for. The house was mostly still. Her divorce had emptied more than just rooms. It had hollowed out the routines, the sounds, the expectations. She moved through the space like a ghost retracing old paths, but there was something new in her movements now, an invisible weight that made everything feel heavier and more fragile. She didn't expect to see him again so soon. But on the third morning, just as she was placing a mug of coffee down on the kitchen counter, she heard the knock. It was soft, hesitant, like a question wrapped in wood. Her breath hitched, not from surprise but from the quiet truth that she had been hoping for it. When she opened the door, there he was, same quiet demeanor, same steady eyes. He didn't ask if he could come in, and she didn't offer words. It was as though they both knew that whatever this was between them no longer required permission. It simply existed, taking shape in the gaps left behind by everything else that had crumbled. He stepped into the house and she stepped back to let him. Something about his presence made the silence feel less oppressive. He asked if she needed help with anything around the house, and although she didn't, she said yes. Not because there was work to be done, but because she didn't want to be alone again. Together they spent the afternoon fixing the loose cabinet in the kitchen, sorting through old photographs, and pulling weeds from the neglected garden. These tasks meant little, but they gave their hands something to do and their minds something to hold on to. At one point, the heat outside became unbearable and she suggested they take a break. They ended up on the living room floor again, surrounded by the soft hum of the fan and the dim light that filtered through the curtains. She noticed the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. There was no obvious intent behind it, nothing overt or invasive, just a quiet observation that made her skin flush and her throat tighten. She tried to push the feeling away, reminding herself of who he was or who he had been, but the lines had already begun to blur. That evening, they ordered food and ate in near silence, both of them aware of the tension that had crept back into the room. It wasn't awkwardness, it was something slower and more insidious. An awareness of proximity. An awareness of breath and movement and time. She watched his hands as he poured drinks, his forearms taut and steady. He moved with the kind of ease that came from not needing to impress anyone, and that, somehow, made her feel more vulnerable than she had expected. After dinner, they stayed in the living room, the television playing something neither of them were watching. The light flickered across their faces, but their attention was somewhere else entirely. The distance between them on the couch had diminished, bit by bit, as though drawn together by something magnetic and unseen. She could smell his skin, clean, sun-warmed, familiar in a way that felt new and wrong all at once. Her own breath had become shallower, more noticeable, and every time their arms brushed accidentally, she flinched inward, not from discomfort, but from the fear of what she was beginning to feel. He leaned back, stretching slightly, and the fabric of his shirt pulled tight across his chest. She forced her eyes away, ashamed of the heat crawling up her neck. It wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was something else, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Desire. But not the loud, obvious kind. This was quieter, buried beneath years of neglect and disappointment. And it terrified her. Later that night, after he left again, the house seemed colder. She sat in the living room long after he was gone, replaying every moment, every glance, every small gesture. She told herself it meant nothing. That he was just being kind, supportive, perhaps even protective. But the look in his eyes had shifted. She had seen it. She had felt it. And no amount of rationalization could undo the way her heart had begun to respond. She tried to sleep, but her thoughts kept circling back to him. The way he stood in the doorway before leaving, hesitating just a moment longer than necessary. The way his fingers had brushed hers when he handed her a glass. None of it should have mattered. None of it should have meant anything. But it did. And as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized with a sinking feeling that the boundaries between them were fading faster than she had the strength to reinforce. The days following their prolonged evening together unfolded with an odd stillness. The woman moved through her house with an almost mechanical rhythm, attempting to distract herself with chores, calls she didn't want to return, and the occasional half-hearted attempt at cooking something she knew she wouldn't eat. But it wasn't enough. The silence of the house no longer felt like peace, it was a vacuum, a place where memory echoed too clearly. She found herself gravitating toward the chair where he had sat, her fingers brushing against the fabric as if searching for a trace of warmth. It felt absurd, and yet she did it again the next day, and the one after that. The emotional tension that had been building inside her was no longer silent. It had a pulse. It had heat. And no matter how much she told herself to stop thinking of him in those terms, her mind betrayed her. She remembered the way his shoulders tensed when he concentrated, the sound of his laugh low in his chest, the softness in his gaze when he looked at her as if seeing more than just grief. Her dreams were becoming vivid, too vivid. They disturbed her not because of what they showed, but because of how they made her feel. Wanted. Touched. Held. And every morning she woke with guilt tangled in her bedsheets. She told herself it was the divorce. That it had shaken her so completely she was grasping for any form of closeness. It made sense. She was vulnerable. He was present. And he was someone she had known for years, someone who had once called her a parental figure, however loosely. But the way he had looked at her recently wasn't the way one looks at a parent. Nor had her reaction been the response of a woman purely concerned with boundaries. The lines had shifted, twisted into something ambiguous, and the more she tried to clarify them, the more they slipped from her grasp. He came back the next afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip into that soft golden hue that made the house glow from the inside out. She hadn't expected him, and her heart lurched with an uncomfortable mix of dread and anticipation when she saw him through the window. She didn't have time to compose herself before opening the door. He stepped inside with a familiarity that made it difficult to pretend that things were still normal. He asked about the garden again, offering help, suggesting new plants, anything to fill the air between them with words instead of silence. She nodded, grateful for the distraction, but her chest was tight. They went outside, their hands brushing occasionally as they worked side by side. The soil was dry and she knelt beside the beds pulling at the weeds while he pruned the bushes. The sunlight caught on his arms, now damp with sweat, and she had to look away. She asked a question about the pruning shears, trying to steady her voice, but it cracked anyway. He answered gently, but there was something in the way he said her name that made her stomach twist. It was as if he was asking a question without speaking it. As if he too was lost inside this haze. When they finished, she suggested they sit for a moment before heading inside. They sat on the back steps, sipping lemonade, the condensation beating on the glasses. The air around them was charged neither hot nor cold, but thick with something unspeakable. She didn't know when he moved closer, only that when she turned her head slightly, their faces were closer than they should have been. Her breath hitched, and in that stillness, something shifted permanently. He didn't touch her, not yet, but he didn't need to. The space between them had dissolved. What remained was an understanding. Silent. Heavy. Unavoidable. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed completely. The air was warmer, heavier. He followed her inside, and neither of them said a word. She placed the empty glasses on the counter, her hands trembling slightly, and when she turned, he was there, only a foot away. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, could feel the way her heart had begun to race, and she hated how her body reacted before her mind had caught up. She didn't step back. And he didn't step away. He asked if she was okay, his voice lower than usual, and she nodded too quickly. She looked down at the floor, then at his shoes, then at the space between them, which was growing narrower with each heartbeat. When she finally looked up, his eyes met hers, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, caught in something they couldn't name. Then without thinking, without deciding, she reached for his arm. It was a small gesture, harmless on its own, but loaded with something far more dangerous. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. And she didn't let go. The silence thickened around them, louder than any words could be. They stood in the kitchen like that for several long minutes, time stretching out as if testing them. Her fingers remained lightly on his arm, his breath brushing against her forehead, and her heart thudding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. There was no plan, no script, no moment of clarity. Just a magnetic pull that neither of them could seem to resist anymore. Eventually she stepped back, not out of resistance, but out of fear. Not of him, but of herself. She turned quickly and busied herself with dishes that didn't need cleaning, her back to him, her hands shaking. He stood there for another moment before quietly excusing himself. She heard the door close, and with it, something inside her cracked open wider. The danger wasn't in what had happened. It was in how badly she wanted more. The next morning, the house felt strangely unfamiliar, as though it no longer belonged entirely to her. The objects were the same, the couch with its faded cushions, the kitchen table littered with unopened mail, the framed photographs of a life she was no longer living, but the air had changed. It carried the residue of something unspoken, something that had not yet happened but was already real. She wandered through the rooms with a nervous stillness, every movement deliberate, every pause heavy with the weight of anticipation and denial. She told herself she had imagined it, that her loneliness had constructed fantasies where none should exist, but her body told a different story. It remembered his closeness, the warmth of his skin, the silent invitation that had hovered in the space between them like a held breath. She tried to return to her routines. She folded laundry that had been sitting in a basket for days. She washed the same plate twice. She opened a book but couldn't get past the first page. Her thoughts circled endlessly, returning again and again to the moment in the kitchen, to the way his eyes had searched hers, to the almost touch that had felt more intimate than anything in recent memory. It would have been easier if he hadn't returned. If the silence had stretched long enough to convince her it had all been a mistake. But that afternoon he was back. As though nothing had changed. As though everything had. This time he didn't knock. He walked in with the same quiet confidence he had always carried, and she met him in the hallway with a startled glance that quickly turned into something softer, more uncertain. He offered to help with the garage, an excuse, maybe, or perhaps just another opportunity to be near her without forcing the issue. She agreed, not because the garage needed attention, but because she didn't trust herself to say no. They worked in silence for a while, surrounded by dust-covered boxes and forgotten tools. The narrowness of the space brought them closer together, their arms brushing occasionally, their breath mingling in the stale warmth of the enclosed air. She found herself stealing glances when he wasn't looking, noticing the lines of his neck, the curve of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as he lifted heavier items with ease. It was no longer just an emotional dependency forming, it was physical, undeniable, and it terrified her. She knew the risk, the damage it could cause if she let it go any further. But logic had begun to erode beneath the quiet ache of wanting. Later, they sat on the back porch again, not speaking, watching the sunlight shift through the trees. The silence between them had matured into something complex, no longer uncomfortable but charged. She could feel his eyes on her, could sense the hesitation in his posture, the way he leaned toward her without quite committing. She didn't move away. Part of her wanted to, desperately, but her body betrayed her again, leaning subtly in return, closing the last of the distance between them. When their shoulders touched, it felt like permission. That night, after he left, the silence in the house became unbearable. She walked from room to room, not looking for anything in particular, but unable to sit still. Her reflection in the hallway mirror startled her. She looked like someone else, someone younger and more afraid. Someone waiting for something she couldn't name. She sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers twisted in the hem of her shirt, her breath shallow. Every sound in the house seemed louder than usual, the ticking of the clock, the groan of the pipes, the faint creak of the floorboards settling. And underneath it all, the echo of his presence still lingered. The dreams came again, vivid and heavy with sensation. They weren't explicit, not in the way she feared, but they were intimate. In the dreams, he stood close, spoke in soft tones, touched her hand with reverence. She woke flushed and disoriented, her heart racing, her throat dry. The longing was no longer something she could rationalize or dismiss. It had become part of her, woven into her grief, her healing, her identity. And that realization both humbled and horrified her. The next morning, she found herself hesitating before getting dressed. Her hand hovered over a sweater that she hadn't worn in months, one she used to wear when she wanted to feel comfortable but presentable. She chose it without thinking, then changed her mind, opting instead for something lighter, something that clung more closely to her body. She told herself it was because of the weather. It wasn't. She was preparing for his return before he had even said he'd come. And he did come. They ended up in the living room again, side by side on the couch, a movie playing in the background that neither of them acknowledged. The room was dim, and the only light came from the flickering screen and the fading sunset bleeding through the curtains. Their knees touched once, then again. Neither of them moved away. Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain he could hear it, and when she turned to say anything, she found him already watching her. There was no dramatic gesture, no sweeping motion. Just a shift. A breath. A moment suspended between hesitation and surrender. She didn't remember who leaned in first. It was slow, tentative, a question asked not with words but with proximity. Their foreheads nearly touched and then, finally, their lips did. Softly at first, uncertain. Then again, with more clarity. The kiss was brief, but it shattered everything. When they pulled apart, she couldn't look at him. She stood quickly, her hand brushing her mouth, her eyes wide with something between shame and hunger. He didn't say anything. He stood too, but he didn't reach for her. He watched her for a long moment, as if giving her a chance to undo it all, to pretend it hadn't happened. But they both knew it had. She turned her back to him, her hands trembling at her sides, and he stepped out the front door without another word. She stood there long after he left, her breath shallow, her body burning. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a decision, one she hadn't meant to make, but had made all the same. And now nothing would be the same again. She didn't sleep that night. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a place of restless pacing and unanswered questions. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, wrapping around her limbs like a warning. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, too close, too familiar, and felt the echo of the kiss that had upended everything. Her body still trembled from it, but it wasn't only desire that made her uneasy. It was the realization of how far she had already stepped beyond the boundary of what could be undone. The moment had not been impulsive. It had been building slowly, quietly, until it became inevitable. And now it was part of her. By morning, she felt hollowed out, as if a storm had passed through her and taken parts of her with it. She moved through the motions of the day, coffee, laundry, voicemails she ignored, but it all felt distant, mechanical. She was aware of her own silence, of how deeply it had settled into her. She didn't cry, though she felt like she should. Instead, she sat by the window for hours, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. She wasn't waiting for him. Or at least, that's what she told herself. But her ears perked at the sound of any car passing by. Her heart skipped at every unexpected noise from the driveway. When he finally arrived in the late afternoon, she didn't open the door right away. She stood on the other side of it, her hand hovering over the knob, breathing in slow, shallow patterns as though trying to rehearse what she would say. But there were no words. There never had been. She opened the door and stepped aside, letting him in without a sound. The energy between them was different now. Still charged, still intense, but quieter. As if both of them were afraid to speak the truth too soon. They sat on the couch again, only this time there was no movie, no distraction, just silence and the weight of what had already begun. Their eyes met briefly, but neither of them smiled. There was nothing casual about what they were doing anymore. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to still the trembling, but it was no use. Her skin felt too thin, too exposed. She could feel every inch of space between them, the air vibrating with unsaid things. He leaned forward slightly, not reaching for her but simply moving closer. It was a gesture she recognized, the same quiet gravity that had always drawn them together without force. And still, she didn't move away. When his hand finally touched hers, she didn't pull back. The contact was soft, almost reverent, and her eyes fluttered shut for a moment. This wasn't just lust. It wasn't even comfort. It was the strange, aching need to be seen, fully and without judgment, even in her most fragile state. She had never imagined that she would be here, like this, caught in the breathless pause before a decision that would unravel everything she'd known. She thought of the years she had spent trying to be good, to be careful, to live by the rules expected of her. She thought of the way her ex-husband had made her feel invisible, of the months since the divorce where she had lived like a ghost in her own life. And then she thought of this boy, not a boy anymore, who looked at her like she mattered. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to justify or explain. It was a whisper of acceptance, a surrender that had been forming long before she'd had the courage to name it. And he understood, perhaps even before she did. There were no declarations, no grand promises. Just movement. Slow, deliberate, cautious. Their bodies met in quiet understanding in the tender rhythm of two people who had already crossed the line long ago. Afterward, she lay beside him, her fingers curled against her chest, her breath slowing, her mind still racing. The room felt smaller now, but not in a suffocating way. It was as if the space had folded inward to contain the secret they now shared. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Words felt useless now. What they had done didn't need to be named. It lived between them, a fragile truth stitched into the silence. She knew the consequences. They didn't need to be spelled out. This wasn't a love story. It wasn't salvation. It was something else, something messier, something rooted in need and grief and human imperfection. But it was real. More real than anything she had felt in years. And maybe that was why it scared her so much. The next morning she woke before him. She stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the stillness of the yard. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long golden streaks across the floor. She felt different, but not better. Not lighter. Just changed. Her reflection in the glass was unfamiliar, softer somehow, but also more solemn. She wasn't sure who she was now. He emerged later, his steps quiet, his presence calm. They didn't talk about what had happened. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She made breakfast as if it were any other day, though her hands moved more carefully, more deliberately. When he left, he kissed her on the forehead, not possessive, not passionate, just present. It was both a comfort and a wound. She watched him drive away, her arms folded tightly around herself. The door closed with a final click and the house was silent again. But it wasn't the same silence. It held something now. A truth that could never be unspoken, a choice that could never be undone. She stood in the center of her living room, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had crossed into a place from which there was no return. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply stood still, the quiet wrapping around her like a second skin, waiting for the consequences to arrive.